Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar session today, Creating Effective PLCs and Determining Needs and Implementing Interventions. We're happy to have you with us today. Our presenter today is Heather Jenkins. She's been with Demonstrated Success for a year and a half or something like that. She's miraculous. She used to be a classroom teacher and also worked in data and some other technology industry locations. And she is our assessment and mathematics director. And we're grateful for Heather, and that's me, one box down, and I am the professional development director at DS. And we have with us today Annie Wallace, who's a terrific person and also happens to be the math specialist for the state. So we're happy to have her today. She helped us out with this presentation. And Jennifer Cavallari is not here, but she intended to be, but she had a conflicting meeting. So welcome all. We're happy to have you. So once again, we are so grateful to the New Hampshire Department of Ed because they've enabled us to bring you all of this wonderful professional development free of charge to schools. And it feels wonderful to be able to do that. So thank you. And this is the fourth of our 5 webinars on PLCs. You're all muted. You, however, are welcome and encouraged to ask questions through the Q&A section of your Zoom screen. And you can put other information, resources, thoughts in the chat session for everyone to see. And tomorrow you'll be getting an email with a link to a professional development certificate for the time and a video of this webinar and the PowerPoint itself and any supporting documents. So you can expect that tomorrow. And if you don't get it, just send us an email.
All right.
I'll hand off to you, Heather.
Yes. So this is where I take over. Thank you again so much for being here today. I am going to turn my camera off as we go through the remainder of the presentation. But again, please ask questions. I will say on a couple of these webinars that we had for PLC, we've had some folks trying to raise their hands during the webinar to ask questions. It doesn't work quite as well in a large webinar format, so we will ask you to please enter anything you need to into the Q&A. That goes straight to us. We'll monitor those questions and we'll get started. This is, again, the 4th out of 5 webinars for PLC. If you have been to all of the webinars, this first little part is going to be a review. I did shorten it up a little bit for this particular one, hoping that people have been coming to each one of them. So just first starting off a review of PLC. Again, if you've seen any of these webinars, these graphics look familiar to you, but we have a ton of data. We have very limited time, a lot of time to get a lot of things in, or very little time to get a lot of things in. So PLC really helps us figure out and use our time wisely with protocols and procedures to be able to look at data to help us inform instruction. The 3 big ideas of PLC are ensuring that all students learn, creating a culture of collaboration and focusing on results. And we have 4 driving questions for PLC. What do we want our students to learn? How will we know when they have learned it? What will we do when they haven't learned it? And what will we do when they have learned it? So if you're ever looking at what meetings are going on in your buildings, if you're answering some of these questions, then it is definitely a PLC, and we really focus on this. PLC is a whole school community. It is not just my students and your students, me and my classroom, you and yours. It's not even just my 3rd grade team that I'm working on. It is a whole school community. And we want to really focus on having that sort of shared purpose and vision for what we want our students to be doing at each grade level and throughout the grade levels. It is commitment on all levels of your specific school building or your possibly your district as well, and making sure that everybody has shared goals and they all filter through the grade levels and the schools so that everybody can be on the same page and everybody's really invested in student learning. When we talk about PLC, we really talk about John Hattie. He's the educational researcher that has done a lot of research on what the influences are on student learning. And he ranked student learning, it's called the Hattie effect, on what the reverse effects are all the way over to the most desired effects for student learning. And collective teacher efficacy is the highest sort of indicator of student learning of all the different effects that he researched. What that means is that teachers working together and continuing to have that appropriately high and challenging expectation of what a year's worth of growth is for a year's worth of input, that is what everybody is really working towards. That is the biggest indicator, right? So when you have your teachers working together, you have them all working towards those high goals, then you are going to have the most student learning. We'll come back to John Hattie in just a little bit too. He is really has some amazing information on what student learning is and how you can ensure that it's happening. Also, on a review of PLC, we have 6 components of successful teams. When you are doing any sort of PLC, you want to be able to create effective teams. So these are some of the ways that you can do that: creating norms and roles, making sure you have consistent protocols. You need clear communication plans. You need those shared, articulated, and measurable goals. Everybody's accountable, and you have timelines throughout that ensure that everybody's on the same page at all times. What happens in a PLC cycle? We're going to start with that highly effective research-based core instruction. We're going to systematically identify students who are not succeeding in that core program or also might need some additional help. And then we're going to provide those students with additional time and support until they master the targets. So this is our flow chart, I guess you would say, for what we do with PLC. So we're teaching that content, we're assessing learning, we're reviewing the data, and figuring out, are students ready to move on? If they aren't, we're going to discuss together in our teams what instructional ideas, how we can change and reteach differently, right? Not just do the same thing again, how we're going to do things differently. We'll assess that learning. It goes back around the circle again. If the students are ready to move on, you discuss what of those instructional ideas that you all put into place, you extend, and then you teach new content and you can move on. So this cycle continues until students are ready to move on and that everybody is at the level of which you need them to be. So what happens in PLC meetings? We're going to identify the essential learning targets. In doing that, we are also going to make sure that students are aware of what their role is in meeting those targets as well. We're going to create, find, and correct common data. We're going to review data. We're going to determine which students need reteaching and who might need enrichment. We're going to constantly discuss where students are, talk about instructional strategies, share new ideas with each other, and plan for instruction. And this last one, reflect, celebrate, and document. The document is in all caps for a reason. The documentation in this ensures that everybody's on the same page, and it also allows us to really look at some of those instructional strategies and some of these protocols that we have and eat from year to year to be able to help us and really guide our instruction. Are there any questions that we have at this point for just an overview of PLC? I think that Karen might be muted. I'm assuming
there are no questions, Heather.
Okay, thanks. Just making sure. Okay. So when we talk about today, our focus is really on the types of interventions and just intervention in general when it comes to the PLC process. In our other webinars that we've done, we've discussed how, like, all the details of creating those effective teams. We've discussed creating year-long SMART goals. We've already discussed also looking at that data dive process. So now we're doing all the data dives, and now we're looking really at the intervention piece for this particular webinar. So just to discuss a little bit and to review different types of interventions, these are all the things that we were sort of hearing of the way that interventions might be done in different schools. So we have the RTI model, response to intervention. We have the win time, what I need or what I need now time. And then some people just call it intervention. Some folks are moving on to MTSS and the multi-tiered system of support. For us today, when we're talking about intervention, we're talking about really, regardless of what you call it, sort of that intervention model where we're taking a look at data and we're seeing where some gaps may be, and we're doing some type of intervention. So regardless of what you call it, we're going to be really just talking about how we're using that data to inform our instruction and interventions. The different types of interventions that we have, you have a collaborative intervention where students are working together in groups. You have one-on-one where students are working intensively with one educator. There's a lot of classroom-based intervention where you're supporting their learning within the classroom setting. We have behavioral interventions, social emotional interventions, and also this last one, the peer tutoring. There's a lot of research out there that's really showing the effectiveness of peer tutoring and pairing different students up together and having, possibly somebody at a different level, a higher level of understanding, helping students with lower levels of understanding, and just having that sort of interaction with their peers has been really effective. So rules of thumb for intervention. Intervention needs to be research supported. So you do not need to buy a program. A lot of folks feel like I need to, do LLI if we're doing any sort of reading intervention or purchase specific programs. You definitely can, and there is room for that in schools that have that particular budget. But it is not necessary for you to buy a specific program for intervention. However, you need to make sure that the methods that you use are supported by research. So examples would be, these are supported by research: using manipulatives, chunking the learning, delivering in small groups, student goal setting and monitoring of their own learning, rereading for fluency. So you're really just looking at, when you're doing interventions, that it needs to be supported by some sort of research. John Hattie also has some really great information on what's called visible learning. So when it comes to intervention or any type of learning, really in a classroom, having students monitor and understand their own learning is really crucial. So I wanted to give you the link to the site where John Hattie's talking specifically about visible learning. And this has to do with, in the beginning, it sort of started to do with learning targets and making sure that students had a purpose or understanding of what they were learning. But it's really more than that, and making sure and ensuring students that have an understanding of what they need to do to meet that particular level of learning, right? So it's not just, here's what you need to learn, it's here's what you are doing or what you need to understand to be able to meet that standard. So there's some more information there. And then here I was talking a little bit, looking at the tiers of intervention. So this is not news to you probably, but we have different tiers of intervention. That tier 1 is that core classroom instruction. Tier 2 is that targeted small group instruction, and tier 3 is that intensive individual intervention that students may need. Both tier 1 and tier 2 interventions can be done within the classroom. It doesn't mean that as you move off from that core classroom instruction that students have to be pulled out of your classroom. You can definitely do some of that tier 2 instruction inside your classroom. A lot of some of the intervention that we're looking at today are really that tier 2 instruction, right? When we're intervening and we're looking at data and figuring out student needs, it is a lot of targeted small group instruction. So obviously, as the tiers increase, the level of support will also increase. And then here's what we have. These are just rules of thumb traditionally for the different tiers. So tier 1 is about 80% of your, or 80 to 100% really, whole class instruction. So if you have a specific skill that you find that 80% or more of your students are not getting, that is tier 1. That's your whole class. You're going to continue to instruct in the whole group setting. If you have roughly 15%, maybe 20% of your class that isn't getting it, so it's a little bit smaller group, that might be tier 2 or that small group targeted intervention there. For those 5%, those real outliers that they're just really not getting it, maybe you've done that tier 1 and tier 2 instruction and they're still having trouble, that's where you move on to the tier 3, and that's intense individualized instruction there. For academic supports and the types of interventions, we had, for one of our workshops, we had these tiered supports that we have, and just some examples of what you can do for the supports for tier 1 for academics, tier 2 and tier 3. Just some ideas that you might have to be able to implement those particular tiers of instruction. And then here's what we have for reading anchor standards. The interventions, when we talk about any sort of interventions, I always like to look at the standards, right? We want to make sure that our interventions are directly correlated with our standards. So for reading anchor standards, this is really K to 8. You have the same standards that are threaded throughout each grade level. So here's your reading anchor standards. And then here's some reading intervention focus areas that are thoughts for what you might do for specific interventions. This link here is to the Achieve the Core. They're the priority instructional content. It's both ELA and math. It's a super long document off the Achieve the Core website. But I really liked, Annie sent it along to me, and I really liked the way that each grade level was laid out. And it shows you what your focus areas are for both ELA and for math. And it just lets you know some of the things that students are doing at that particular grade level for that standard. So it can help you figure out if students aren't really getting some of the concepts. It's just another way to look at that standard and think about some different strategies you might use or different ways that students might be showing their understanding of a specific standard. For math, these are your key concepts for each grade level. Again, K to 8. High school for both ELA and math and other subject areas is a little bit different because you have a whole set of high school standards, and then depending on which particular class you are teaching, you have specific standards that your high school has deemed are going to be appropriate for that particular class. So it is a little bit different, but for our elementary levels, you have key concepts at each grade level. There's also a link here to that Achieve the Core website, so you can see that. And then there's key shifts. Annie has created these documents that show you where the shifts are within each grade level for your standards. And then here are some examples of what math intervention focus areas can be. Again, that same link is here to that Achieve the Core instructional content document. I'm seeing some questions, or maybe possible questions in the chat or Q&A. Is there anything that I need to cover, Karen, before I move on?
No.
Okay, all right. So Now we're looking at determining the needs and implementing some sort of intervention. So when we're determining our needs within that PLC model, we're going to focus on 1 year-long goal. A lot of times when folks do interventions, and I have been there as well, is that they look at the unit that they're working on right now and they figure out all of these interventions, and then they're doing that. Some kids still aren't getting it, but now they've moved on to another unit. So forget that now when we're spinning our wheels and we're trying to figure out interventions for our current unit, and it goes on and on and on. And it constantly feels like we are, all I can say is like on this hamster wheel of like, how can we get this kids to where they need to be? But now we're moving on and we didn't actually get them there. So really with PLC, we're looking at a year-long goal, and then all the interventions that we're doing feed into that goal. And I'll explain that a little bit in more depth in the next few slides. But really, we're looking at students' needs and helping them at their different levels. And we traditionally intervene at that student's level. So we figure out the area of need and we figure out where those students are. We kind of group them together and we make sure that we're meeting them at their needs. So in doing that, I talked about this when we created our SMART goals, in that we have that year-long goal. So within that year-long goal, to be able to create that, we need to look at data, right? We did that in a previous session. We really went through and we created the SMART goals. This is just a little bit of review of that. So we're going to look at data. We're going to look at the standards. We need to look at our priority or power standards, right? And then we also are pulling in our own teacher input, right? What we're seeing and what has been happening either over a number of years or what have you. So we have different types of data that we collect. First one is previous student data, right? So I have a student and this is all of their data for this particular student over a number of years. Right. So I can see all of the, it looks like this, I could have an 8th grade student here and I can see all their New Hampshire SAS stuff. I can see some of their fact fluency. I might have NEWA data. I might have, DIBELS, iReady, whatever it is. I see all of this student's data in one spot. We can also look at beginning of the year current student data. Right. So I've done an assessment. This is the beginning of the year. I'm assessing where students are at, and I can see where each student is specifically on these skills. I can also look at what we call historical data. We tend to use 3-year data. This happens to be New Hampshire SAS data, but it could be, maybe you're looking at New Hampshire SAS and NEWA, or you're looking at iReady, whatever you're looking at for historical data. I really like to use this type of data when I'm creating my year-long SMART goal, because it shows me over time where I might have some level of, maybe I'm not teaching a specific standard to fruition, or maybe it's that every year this particular standard is low for my students. So I know that I'm going to get a lot of information and a lot of sort of growth if I pick these particular standards. So you can look at your curriculum effectiveness when you look at historical data. You're not just looking at your students this year, you're looking at students over time. So there's none of that, oh, well, I remember that group of students, that was a really high group, or that was a really low group. You're looking at the grade as a whole over time. So you get to see trends of those areas of strength or weakness. And then if you're looking at those traditionally low performing areas of your curriculum, you can make instructional changes that make a really large impact. So when we're looking at any data, we look and we follow that data-driven dialogue protocol, where we have the phased approach for looking at the data. We have gone through this. I'm not going to go through this. This is just, again, a little bit of review on the protocol that we use to look at data. We also have that data dialogue short form. And so we're able to go through each particular phase of looking at the data and review it together. Helps our teams stay on track for that. And again, if you were looking at 3-year data, you might take a peek at something and you might articulate a SMART goal because you're seeing some weakness in a specific area. This one happens to be looking at perform operations with multi-digit whole numbers with decimals. It's a 5th grade standard. And so we've looked at that data and we've deemed that this is our year-long SMART goal. We're really going to, no matter what portion of our math curriculum we are in, we're going to continue to focus our sort of work for the year on this particular set of standards. We traditionally do clusters of standards, not one standard by itself. So this particular cluster of standards has 3 different standards within it. And again, we're going to figure out where in each particular unit it might feed into this. So this is our year-long SMART goal. After we do that, we create a cycle SMART goal. So we're going to start our first cycle of PLC. We tend to have 3 cycles. So maybe for cycle 1, I'm going to look at current student data now. Right? So I've done, this happens to be a math modular. It could be any sort of math assessment that you have within your particular program that relates to your year-long goal. And now I'm looking at how my students are performing. What does this data tell me, right? So I'm going to start looking at how my students performed on that. I'm going to look at maybe where they're relatively low, right? And then I'm going to look at the standards for that, right? So now I have these 2 standards. I've done an assessment and I found that these 2 standards are the lowest performing for my students. And I'm also then looking at, interesting, that this particular standard relates to my year-long goal, right? So now I'm going to just really focus on what do I have for this particular standard for this cycle. I'm going to work specifically on this standard here. So then this is my SMART goal for this first cycle. And so I'm specifically creating the SMART goal that goes with that standard of finding whole number quotient, finding whole number quotients of whole numbers with up to 4-digit dividends and 2-digit dividers in context, right? So it directly relates to 5 NBT6. So now I have my cycle SMART goal. Now what, right? So now I've deemed this is exactly what I'm going to focus on for this particular cycle. So we have what's called a PLC intervention planning page. There's so many versions of them out here. I think the point of this is really to make sure that you understand, like, you need to write it down. How are you grouping students? What are the strategies that they're going to do? Who is responsible for it? It's really important to gather all that information and keep it in one spot so that everybody continues to be on the same page. So now that I have my standard, I need to break that apart when I'm determining my intervention, right? So I've got this here. Now I've got this, define the whole, this is my information here, my specific standard. And what I've done there is we've broken that standard down into sort of a little bit more manageable piece, right? So now I've got divide multi-digit numbers using strategies based on, and I have place value, properties of operations, and relationship between multiplication and division. So for right now, I would say maybe in my unit, we're really starting to look at place value. We've taught a lot of different parts of place value, but I really see that kids are having trouble still with place values. So it's a really sort of basic start to this particular unit that I'm working on and for this standard. So now I've said I'm going to work on place value. So here's what ends up happening. I've created here using the traditional algorithm based on place value rather than memorization of steps. So I'm working on that 5 MBT6, and the specific area that I'm working on is using the traditional algorithm based on the place value. I'm not doing the memorization of steps. I'm not making sure that kids understand each step. I'm really breaking that apart. So now what I'm going to do is maybe one of my groups is really in the beginning stages, and we need to do number talks with them. We need to make sure that they're really understanding that place value and how we're breaking apart numbers. Maybe another group is looking at solving specific problems based on place value, but they're using multiple strategies to do that. So they're starting to build on that a little bit more. And maybe my last group is going to be doing actual math tasks that are based on place value. So now they've got the tasks. I've created, they could be working in small groups. They could be working with a partner, and they're trying to figure out how to solve those tasks it's a little bit more elevated than the last group. Any of the progress monitoring strategies would go over here. Who's the responsible teacher, what the location is, all of that information goes on here. You could also fill out, we have another form that's the strategies and materials. So any materials that you're going to be using, other strategies that you're going to have, the more information that you keep and put together, the better you're going to be sort of moving forward, right? So if you ever do those types of interventions, again, you have all of that information there. We have a lot of moving parts in our schools right now. People are coming in, people are kind of moving around. So to have all of this information in one spot is really more crucial than ever, I feel like, to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Any questions that we have with this at this point, Karen?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So that's a math example here. I wanted to show a little bit of an ELA example as well. I'm not going to get really deep into the sort of process of creating the SMART goals. I just sort of reviewed that, and I know we've already had that webinar. But for my ELA example, I'm saying that basically I'm looking at whatever sort of historical data, and I've deemed that writing is an area of weakness for us, specifically evidence and elaboration. Okay. So again, if I'm thinking that that is going to be my focus for the year, I'm going to create a year-long SMART goal out of that. And so this would be my year-long SMART goal, right? So by a specific date, I have my grade 4 students will be able to show an increased ability in providing evidence and elaboration in writing. And I am basing it off whatever assessment that I did the data dive on. This happens to be the New Hampshire SAS summative assessment. I want them to increase to 70% proficiency of being a level 3 or above. And so now I have my year-long SMART goal that has to do with my specific area of weakness for ELA. So I need to look at the standards, right? What does that mean for me? So I would look at my grade 4 standards for writing. This is text types and purposes. And my evidence and elaboration is incorporated into my writing standards here. So I just want to make sure that I'm really clear on what I need to be doing at my specific grade level for making sure that my students are really getting what they need to and meeting the standards that are there. As I look at the standards, now maybe I'm going to go to my cycle goal 1. When it comes to writing standards and writing for your cycles, right? If we're looking at evidence and elaboration for the whole year, then perhaps my first cycle goal is going to be on a specific type of writing. So that's what I've created for my cycle goal. Is this particular cycle goal is going to be looking at informational writing, right? And they are going to improve their evidence and elaboration for informational writing, as demonstrated by an increase of 50% of students being at a level 3 or above on a specific assessment. This happens to be the New Hampshire SAS informative writing modular assessment. Now, the way that I got to this particular SMART goal is I did a pre-assessment, right? We talked about pre-assessments the last time. So that's how I know I want my students to increase to 50%, right? So anytime we're creating our cycle goals, we have to do our pre-assessment first. Then we determine what our cycle goal is going to be. And now we're ready to start doing our intervention, right? So here again is my intervention planning page here. And then this might be some of the options that I would have for my intervention for providing evidence and elaboration for informational text. So over here, some of my strategies might be some of my kids might need to figure out in determining the difference between fact from fiction, right? Maybe some of my students need to find the most convincing evidence within a text. And maybe another group of students they're writing responses to multiple passages, and we're taking a look at that, and maybe they're doing peer review, right? Any progress monitoring strategy you would have over here. And then you would continue to take a look at this and look at the data, see how kids are doing, and continue your interventions if needed. Any questions there?
No questions, Heather. Oh, wait. Are there SAS modular assessments for social studies?
Great question. There technically are not any modular assessments for social studies. We've talked to the folks at Cambium and let them know that it would be really helpful for at least the ELA modulars to have a social studies, like what the topics are for social studies within the ELA modulars. But what ends up happening is social studies teachers, they use the ELA modulars. They just need to talk with, if you have a colleague that is, teaching reading or writing, you just want to make sure you're not giving the same modular assessment. But at this point, there are no social studies topics in the modular assessments. Again, we've given that feedback. So we're hoping at some point that they might be related to social studies topics, but they are not at this point. Okay, so I do want to pause there and see if there are any questions that we have on intervention or any other strategies that we might want to discuss for intervention. Just going to give it just a second. So for looking at interventions, I also want to interject. There are a couple of sites that that are really good sites to look at, to take a look at for if you have a specific program, or you want to look at if the intervention strategy is research-based and how it has been used by others. Karen, I had a slide in here and I'm not really sure what happened to it, but there were a couple of websites that you we had talked about for that. I'm like, where is it?
The websites, I know them off the.
Maybe we can put them in the
two
chat.
of them. Sure.
That would be great. That would be great.
I just got to get the links.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to have Karen put those couple of websites in the chat for you. I am going to, at this point, finish up, but I will stay on. We'll all stay on to be able to answer any sort of questions that you might have about how to do intervention. This again, we have one more webinar coming up in our PLC series. It has to do with progress monitoring and that post-assessment and celebration. And then I'm just taking a peek. I saw something come up in the chat. It says, should all teachers on the team intervene for a specific ELA goal for a certain duration of time and then switch to another math goal for a certain amount of time? There are different, I feel like, Karen, you can chime in on this too. I feel like there's different schools of thought on this. I know that some schools really like to say, okay, for a certain cycle of intervention, we're going to focus on ELA. For the next cycle, we're going to focus on math, and then so on and so forth. For PLC, I do feel like it is most beneficial for you to pick one area and focus on that area for the year. That does not mean that you're not doing some other types of interventions for those kids who are, maybe if you've chosen math for the year, you still have kids that you're still going to do some sort of reteaching or intervention or small group work with for ELA, but your major focus of your intervention would be on whatever you've deemed for your particular year-long goal. I also know that some sites choose a year-long goal for math and they choose a year-long goal for ELA. And once you get really good at it, I think that might be doable, but I feel like really concentrating and doing and working on one specific goal and doing really well with that is really the most beneficial. But Karen, if you have other thoughts on that, you can chime in there.
No, I agree with what you said, Heather.
Okay.
Exactly with what you said.
Okay.
Yep. I'm writing in, so I wrote in Florida Center for Reading Research. That's good information about interventions, what works clearinghouse, and then John Hattie's Invisible Learning has great research around interventions. And I think, Heather, you emphasized this need for research-supported interventions, but not necessarily, purchasing boxed things. Yes?
Yes, absolutely. And that John Hattie's site with the visible, it's visible,
sorry.
instead of invisible, but
Oh my God,
I have the link right in the slides here. So what I will do is I will also, if you don't have the links right now for that Florida Center of Reading Research or the What Works.
I put them in the chat.
Yeah, I will also add them to this presentation so that it'll all be in one spot. I'm not sure where that slide ended up going. I was moving things around and might have just taken it off. So sorry about that. Okay, so when you pop off of this webinar, a survey will come up. We love the input that we've been getting from folks. We've been making some tweaks here and there. Any input that you have, if you need any other information, you just let us know. We love your feedback. So know that will pop up as soon as you come off of Zoom. And then if you want to contact any of us, again, I'm Heather Jenkins. I'm more the math person here at Demonstrated Success. Karen, and we also have Tammy, our ELA folks. Annie is your math person at the DOE, and Jenny is your ELA person at the DOE.